Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are just waiting for more folks to get on the call, and we will get started in a couple of minutes.
Hello, everybody. This is Rabbi Jonah Pesner, the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism here in Washington, and the senior vice president of the Union for Reform Judaism. Thank you all so much for joining us on this conference call to reflect a little bit on our Nitzavim campaign, our campaign for voter protection, racial justice in America, and of course, the very consequential presidential election and the election of members of Congress as well. There's so much to talk about, and we're so glad that you took the time to join us. I want to start by acknowledging the moment in time in American history, and for not just the Jewish community, of course, but for all of American society. When we originally planned this call a few weeks ago, we thought it would be a good idea if a few dozen of our stakeholders joined together with us to debrief the election and to think about our racial justice work. Little did we know that the election would be such an earthquake and so consequential, nor did we realize we would have such an overwhelming response. I'm thrilled to share with you that there are more than 600 of you who have registered. You are stakeholders, you are members of our congregations, you are leaders of our work for social justice in communities across North America, you are donors and financial supporters, you are allies, and we're really grateful to you for being with us to have this conversation. We are going to do three things on this call, and we have a distinguished panel of guests who are here with us. We are going to honor the great work on election protection that we did in collaboration with the NAACP, our historic partner, and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. We'll reflect a little bit on our time in Georgia and Ohio and North Carolina and California to understand what we learned, how we move forward based on what we learned, and to celebrate the real impact that we made and what we learned not only about election protection and racial justice, but about power in American society. But we'll, of course, then pivot to the second question, which is how do we interpret this election? How do we make meaning of it? How do we understand it? And third and finally, how do we go forward, continuing to maintain our commitments to our enduring Jewish values, the thousands of years of the prophetic call to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God? We'll need a pathway forward, and our distinguished panel will help us not only understand our election protection work, our understanding of this election, but they'll also inspire us with how we go forward. We'll be joined by Joy Friedman, who is the incredible director of organizing for the Religious Action Center, who has led our Nitzavim Standing Up for Racial Justice campaign. We will hear from our longtime friend and partner, President and Pastor Cornell William Brooks of the NAACP. We'll then be joined by Chris Melody Fields of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, a phenomenal organization and a great partner as we've done this election protection work. We'll then hear a few words from Rabbi Joel Mosbacher, a great leader of our movement-wide campaign, locally and nationally, who will reflect on his time doing election protection work in Ohio, and then offer us some homiletical and liturgical advice as we move forward into Shabbat and make meaning of this election. We'll then hear from former chair of the Commission on Social Action and current executive committee member of the Union for Reform Judaism, Jennifer Kaufman, who will give her California-based perspective and also the movement-wide perspective. The last speaker who will join us is the Associate Director of our Religious Action Center and the Director of the Commission on Social Action, Barb Weinstein, who will give the broader frame of the various issues and priorities that we will have to contend with given the results of the election. One last word before I turn it over to Joy to set up the context of our Nitzavim campaign. I would be remiss if I didn't remind everyone on the call, Torah that you already know, but at this moment we must repeat. I am calling you from the conference room at the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. Literally, it was in this building at this desk that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was drafted. And I retell that story time and again to remind people what our legacy is and what's at stake with the Shelby decision and with all of the voter suppression laws that were passed. But I want to add the corrective. When we were down in North Carolina this August, kicking off our Nitzavim campaign, Reverend Barber, a colleague and friend of Cornell William Brooks from the NAACP, stood at the pulpit and said, Rabbi Pesner, I want to correct you. The Voting Rights Act wasn't written in Washington. It was written in blood in Selma, and it was transcribed in your conference room. I repeat that story because now we need to remember the risk that was taken by the veterans of the civil rights movement, by the courage of the leaders who were willing to go down, whether it was Goodman, Cheney, or Schwerner, or all of those who took risk in order to advance a vision of racial justice and civil rights in America. We, my friends, are confronting an intense moment in time that is no less fraught from risk. And as we make meaning of this election, we ask ourselves, how will we act with the same courage, the same resolve, and the same commitment as our forebears did when they stepped up to lead? And so we have this call as a first conversation about how we will continue to Nitzavim, stand up for justice in America. Joy, will you continue?
Yes, thank you. I'm Joy Friedman. I'm the RAC's Director of Organizing, a role that's given me the privilege of spending the last several years building on the RAC's incredible history in DC by developing and deepening an infrastructure to pursue the RAC's and the reform movement's social justice agenda throughout our country with the 900 reform congregations in North America. That infrastructure across the North American community of the reform movement was called into action about 2 years ago as the deaths of Black men were recorded on cell phone cameras, which shocked us into remembering that structures in our country continue to perpetuate racism and that we are called to act on our historic commitment to dismantle those structures. We took that commitment to the streets with the NAACP last summer, where we walked in the footsteps of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., marching from Selma, Alabama to Washington, D.C., carrying a Torah that over this 40-day march was passed from the arms of one rabbi from our movement to another and shared with people from across race and class and faith lines. 200 rabbis in our movement participated in that. That is 1/10 of our rabbinate. And that work continued this year when we launched Nitzavim, when we said that our movement would stand for inclusion of everyone who was eligible to access the ballot and to ensure that all the obstacles that stood in the way now that this election was not protected for the first time since that march by the Voting Rights Act in its fullness. We would be standing in partnership, and we have. About 1/10 of our congregations, a similar number to those who marched last summer, stood this fall. They stood in North Carolina, they stood in Georgia, they stood in Ohio, and everywhere in between here, New York, and California to ensure that every eligible voter had access to the ballot. And in California, they stood even more deeply for our racial justice commitment by fighting for a ballot initiative that will change parole and the adjudication of cases that include teenagers in a way that will have lasting, deep impact on many families across the state. Jennifer will tell us more about that. So I believe that while many of us may feel pain or confusion about the result of this election, we can also feel very proud. We have done so much. We have begun to build the infrastructure that we so much now will need as we continue to stand for the agenda, the social justice agenda of the reform movement. We will stand, we will work together. We now know, because of what we've built over the last several years and the history of the RAC that we stand upon, that we are up to the challenge. And we know that the challenge will be hard. we will also not have to face it alone. We will have partners in the NAACP, in the Lawyers Committee, in PICO, and many other organizations at the national and local level. And I am pleased to turn over the conversation to our partner, the president of the NAACP, Reverend Cornell Brooks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Joy. Let me just begin with a word of appreciation to Rabbi Pesner, to all of my colleagues at the RAC, the Lawyers Committee, all of you on this call. This is an incredible moment in history, and it is a moment in which we value our partners and our friends, I would say in my Zion, our brothers and sisters in ministry and prophetic ministry. Let me just note this. It is my deep belief that we stand on our history. There's a 1,000-year history. There's certainly the history of the RAC, the history of the NAACP, and we stand on this history together. I'm mindful of the fact that the NAACP, founded 107 years ago by a group of progressive whites with a sprinkling of a few African Americans, with W.E.B. Du Bois in the midst. It was a gathering of Jews and African Americans who committed to the ideal of racial justice. But I'm mindful that our history is a sturdy floor upon which we stand. It is not a ceiling from which we shrink. You've been reminded that the Voting Rights Act was transcribed within the walls of the Reform Action Center. But I'd like to note here that the Voting Rights Act may have been transcribed at the RAC, but I am also mindful of that sepia-tone picture of yesteryear, black and white photograph of a time gone by, in which Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Luther King were walking arm in arm on a path to justice. But when we think about this iconic photograph, it is not frozen in time. It is not a representation of a distant past, but a present reality, a present ongoing partnership, relationship, brotherhood and sisterhood. In other words, this relationship between African Americans and Jews and Jewish Americans is not a matter of a nostalgic past, but a present moment. And so when I think about the story of Esther, and I think about an interrogative, a query, a question that transcends time, namely, who knows that we have come to this royal position for such a time as this? So as we find ourselves in the midst of this post-millennium, if you will, post-millennium civil rights movement, a movement and moment in American history in which that which we thought was long settled, a matter of a democratic and civic assumption, is being questioned, namely the right to vote. And so I think fondly and appreciatively of the moment in which my colleagues and I went to the RAC headquarters, stood not too far, not too distant from the room in which the Voting Rights Act was transcribed, and we stood before your colleagues and the colleagues on this phone and asked for your support, asked for your help in battling back voter suppression, not distant and in the past, but present and dangerous in the present. You will recall all too well that in the wake of the Shelby versus Holder Supreme Court decision of only a few years ago, we saw this Machiavellian frenzy, voter disenfranchisement from one end of the republic to the other. You will recall all too well what happened in Texas in terms of the passage of the omnibus voter suppression law, where over 600,000 votes were in peril. And the NAACP State Conference in Texas had to go before the Fifth Circuit to try to salvage and reclaim and redeem those votes. In North Carolina, 5% of the electorate, those votes were imperiled. And Yea, even only a few days before this election, 4,000 voter registrations, in excess of that amount, were imperiled and had to be reclaimed through our lawyers in the courts, our activists in the streets, and this partnership that is in fact ongoing. And so we stood before your colleagues and said, we need your help. We need you to help us do something about voter suppression. Now, with the memory of having walked together literally 1,002 miles, we started off at a small, humble house in Selma, the home of Miss Amelia Boynton, who stood on that bridge, Edmund Pettus Bridge, 50 years ago, and who was beaten to the pavement. We started out there, spent time in the church, and marched from Selma, Alabama to Washington, D.C. with 1/10 of the Reform Rabbinate walking arm in arm, carrying a Torah next to the American flag, with folks arrayed in blue and gold, namely the colors of the NAACP. So with that as a memory, you all literally answered not just the request of a civil rights organization, I would dare say prayerfully and humbly, a prophetic request, not unlike the Macedonian call that Martin Luther King issued in the wake of two bloody and unsuccessful attempts to march from Selma to Montgomery. And of course, on that third attempt, he had his Macedonian call answered by the likes and forebears and foremothers, heirs, if you will, I should say foreparents, if you will, of the folks on this call. And so in answering that call, we crafted together a voter protection strategy that encompassed Georgia, North Carolina, Alabama, Ohio, New York, California. We saw lawyers responding to this call to protect the ballot. We had lay people, rabbis, all coming together to protect the ballot, leaving their homes to go to distant places to protect the votes of people and communities where they did not necessarily reside, but through whom, I should say, to whom we are connected as a matter of faith, as a matter of our prophetic commitments, as a matter of our democratic values. You answered that call. And so what we've seen is in the course of these many months together and the answering of this call, we've seen no less than 10, count them, 10 cases in which voter suppression has been attested to by the federal courts. As you mentioned, Texas, in North Carolina, in Ohio, again and again and again. What you battled against, what you stood against, was verified, validated, empirically, legally, in the courts. Answering that call on election day is critically important. Why do we say that? Because we set up a national command center in Baltimore at our headquarters to take calls from all across the country. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights did the same, certainly the Legal Defense Fund. And what did we hear and see on election day? We saw folks who tried to vote out of precinct having their votes denied. Misinformation roundabout. In Wisconsin, 50,000 missing ballots. Optical scanners not working. Misinterpretation, misstatement of the law and voting rights policy from one end of the country to the other. And yet, the people on this call, the folks from your congregations, went out and did the work. Now, some of us may be tempted to engage in some hand-wringing pessimism or some discouragement as a consequence of what happened on election day. And we don't say that as a matter of partisanship, but the country is deeply divided in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of faith. And this election has been a soul-testing endeavor. Certainly the campaigns have been as such. But I want to emphasize here, our folks, and by our, I mean collectively our, all the folks on this call and all the people you represent, stood firm, stood resolute, stood, and most importantly, note this, stood together against voter suppression. And in so doing, we were not merely making a statement of our democratic values, but our shared faith. And I want to speak to you here very clearly and unapologetically as a fourth-generation minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. While I'm a civil rights lawyer, my values come from my faith tradition. And my faith tradition is very much connected to the tradition of Reform Judaism via the prophetic faith that we share, that canon of social justice that binds the Black church to the Reform Judaism tradition. And so that is the inspiration, that which compels us, and certainly compels me to do the work that we do. Now, as I mentioned, in the wake of this election, many of us may be tempted to be discouraged. But let us note a few things. Certainly, fewer people turned out to vote than many of us expected across the board, across demographic slices of the American citizenry, from millennials to African Americans, Latinos, than we saw only a few years ago. Certainly, 56% of the electorate showed up to vote, about 130 some odd million, with 100 million folks declining to participate. Those are sobering statistics, very sobering statistics. It is sobering to note that the president-elect was elected without the popular vote and likely, based upon what we've seen in the courts, with some suppressed votes. Certainly, it has been a campaign in which the best of America was not reflected in the rhetoric that went out across America. Certainly, we have seen anti-Semitism normalized, racism regularized or routinized, if you will, misogyny mainstream. When we think about the fact that, according to the ADL, we had American journalists who have Jewish names targeted in terms of cyber anti-Semitic attacks. We have seen our Latino brothers and sisters described in morally odious ways. We've seen women described in just hateful terms. But what's important to note here is, irrespective of the rhetoric of these campaigns, note the actions of these citizen activists, note the actions of our faithful congregants, note the actions of those who stand with the RAC and stand with the NAACP and stand with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. That is to say, folks went to communities all across the country, traveled out to small towns and big cities, witnessed voter suppression and voter intimidation, and tried to do the right thing, and reflected their values not through the prettiness of their words, but by the eloquence of their example. And so, because of what we have seen on Election Day and in many months preceding it, I'm confident in terms of our ability, note this, our ability to bring the country together. Because ultimately, presidential candidates can set a tone with respect to a campaign. And they can certainly, the president-elect can certainly set a tone for the nation. But ultimately, if we're going to provide a vocabulary of civility, a vocabulary of decency, a vocabulary of prophetic justice, that will largely happen by the folks who are on this call and the people we represent. And so I'd like to note here that going forward, a couple of things are critically important. Number one, this election may represent an affirmation for some, a rejection for others, but ultimately it is a tragic opportunity for all of us, a prophetic opportunity for all of us to bring the nation together. It's not an opportunity that some of us sought, but it is. And that simply means that we have this occasion to bring people together by doubling down on the work that we've already committed to doing. That's incredibly important. Number two, we have to move forward an affirmative agenda in terms of voting rights. That means doubling down on the restoration of the Voting Rights Act so that we ensure it has its pre-Shelby efficacy. Two, modernizing the vote so that we have things that we fought so hard for in North Carolina in terms of pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, automatic registration, early voting. Because we fundamentally understand that the right to vote is a civic sacrament presently being desecrated in the temple of our democracy. But there are legislative and policy means by which to ensure that the right to vote is kept safe and sacrosanct, and that which we can pass on as a kind of civic legacy to the next generation. It is a moment in this country where we can do this because we have the record, if you will. Voter fraud is by the day being proven as a fallacy, that which is a kind of speculative toy of politicians, that which is imagined as opposed to voter suppression, which is odious conduct carried out by politicians against the American electorate. We believe that we're in a position and a place where we can do that. Number three, when we look at our, certainly the criminal justice reform agenda in terms of sentencing, juvenile justice reform, this is a moment in the country where we can address those kinds of concerns. We see with the proliferation of these viralized violent videos, more and more Americans, particularly younger Americans, millennial Americans, saying to themselves and saying to one another, we can do something about this in terms of bringing about real policing reform. Lastly, I return back to the story of Esther. And I think about the fact that, Mordecai and the Jewish people, and certainly Esther, was subject to a genocidal decree as a consequence of a homicidal hatred for Mordecai, which was expanded and extrapolated, if you will. But in that moment, that question was posed to Esther: who knows that you've come to this royal position for such a time as this? That is the question that yet resounds in our ears across the ages. We are at this historical moment, in the midst of the difficulties that have been presented to the country, in the midst of all of this racial and ethnic and religious division. We stand flat-footed with a willingness and a desire and a commitment to speak prophetic truth to power. That's a tradition we stand on. That's a history we stand on. And with that history, with that tradition, with that inspiration, and certainly with that faith, we're more than up to the task. And based upon what we've done thus far, the partnership that we've engaged in thus far, we are confident that we are going to prevail. Because certainly we note this: the Selma and Montgomery March was conducted in 1965. The Voting Rights Act is referred to as the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Blood, sweat, and tears were shed for that piece of legislation, and they prevailed against odds infinitely greater than those we face, difficulties infinitely greater than those we have to face and surmount. And so based on that history, based on that tradition, based on the love and affection and prophetic commitment we have to our work and to one another, we will prevail. So with that said, Jonah, let me turn things back over to you.
President Cornell William Brooks, you inspire us and lead us every day. Thank you. It's my pleasure to turn it to Chris Melody Fields from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Chris, thank you so much for your leadership. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, and well, it is a tough act to follow Cornell Brooks, but I just want to start off by saying thank you to everyone on the phone, especially. This has been a really great and wonderful new partnership with us, with the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. I think one of the things that I reflect upon this past year, and especially Election Day, is how incredibly important partnership, community, collaboration, and coordination is. The ability that we had, especially on Election Day, to help thousands of voters across the country was not done alone. It was not simply the work of the Lawyers Committee. It was the work of the NAACP, of the RAC, and countless other coalition partners who came together and knew we had a really unique opportunity to protect the right to vote in ways we haven't done before. So I want to just start off by thanking everyone so much. I think Tuesday and certainly waking up on Wednesday, we, you know, it is definitely a moment of reflection. I certainly have spent most of the last few days sad and scared of what the results mean, but also I know about the power of movement and the people that are committed to justice. And we are going to do everything we can to fight and continue to preserve our democracy, to preserve justice and freedom for our people. One of the things that I've been really thinking about is, you know, one of my sheroes, Dolores Huerta, who said, every moment is an organizing opportunity. Every person is a potential activist. Every minute is a chance to change the world, and that is exactly where we are right now. This is the opportunity for us to organize and fight together to move forward as we look to the next several years. Through election protection, you know, I've always said that this work does not start or stop on Election Day. Election Day is our Super Bowl. It is a moment in the work where we are working aggressively to protect the right to vote. But the work does not start that day, and it is going to continue certainly in the next few months. Just to look, you know, to take a step back and think about where we were leading into Election Day. I want to celebrate some of the victories that we had over the last year, especially on the litigation front. After the Supreme Court decision in Shelby County versus Holder, as Dr. Brooks talked about, you know, there was an aggressive affront to the right to vote in Texas, North Carolina, and countless other states to roll back on the progress that we've made. But in the months leading up to the election, we gained some incredibly significant victories. The striking down of the monster North Carolina bill that said it had discriminatory intent and purpose. I'm actually not a lawyer. I just work with them. I'm an organizer, but to get discriminatory intent and purpose in a litigation case is incredibly difficult. And I think North Carolina serves as an example of what we can do when we organize and we advocate and we litigate together to show and shed the light of the racial discrimination that still continues to exist in this country. We also had a victory in Texas where it said the voter ID law had a discriminatory effect. And immediately for this election, there was a remedy for those 600,000 folks that do not possess the ID. But what we saw in Texas, especially during the early voting period and on Election Day, was the confusion over the status of the voter ID law. The immediate remedy was for those who did not have the ID to sign a declaration and show multiple versions of ID. But what we saw during the early voting period in places like Denton and Leon and Harris County and other places across the state of Texas where I was raised, you know, incorrect information about the former ID law that was incredibly confusing to voters, as well as poll workers giving incorrect information. But the power of election protection, the ability for us to organize and work with local election officials in many of those places, we were able to correct that information quickly and make sure that voters actually had the correct information. We also ran an ad predominantly in African American and Latino media markets to make sure that voters knew that there was support for them. You know, what did Election Day look like? You know, I think this election also showed us how incredibly important it is to have boots on the ground and people helping voters at the polls. You know, in addition to not having the full protections of the Voting Rights Act, the Department of Justice, because of that decision, said they could no longer move forward with their federal observer program, which has been incredibly important, especially in rural areas, to have federal observers to be inside those polling locations and troubleshoot those problems. This year we were in 28 states having some type of election protection program and having boots on the ground. We are still tallying the numbers, but we had at least 8,000 legal and grassroots volunteers, both on the 866 Our Vote hotline and then in the field at the polls, helping voters. The day before election to the 866 Our Vote hotline, we received over 11,000 calls, and on election day alone, we received over 35,000 calls from voters across the country. I think as we continue to tally what we heard throughout the year, will be well over 100,000 calls. I think the major difference this election year than years past is we spent a lot more time on the phone with voters. You know, we've had higher numbers in the past because a lot of people asked us about where their polling places or if they're registered to vote, which is still a significant amount of the calls we receive, but because of access to new tools like that Google and other groups have done, we actually spent a lot of time talking to voters and troubleshooting problems. The other piece that I think really impacted this election, and perhaps one of the reasons why we spent so much time on the phone with voters, is the rhetoric of this election. People were more concerned, more fearful of whether their ballot would count, and it was really important for us through election protection to lead a message that the work and the coalition has voters back, and if they feel any type of intimidation or are concerned about the process of this election and their ability to cast a ballot, to give us a call. And I think that was really, really important going into election day, that voters knew that they were not in this alone, that they had an entire community of advocates across the country, lawyers and just everyday citizens that wanted to participate and make sure that their voices would not be silenced in this election. So it was incredibly important to have that. You know, election day was not without its problems. You know, the things that we saw very early on election day were polling places not opened on time, and all across the nation, but for several hours in many locations, like in Brooklyn and the Bronx, polling places were not open on time. Across the country, we saw failures of equipment or things that were critical around technology for people to cast a ballot were not online in time. In particular, in Durham County, North Carolina, the e-poll books, which were critical to starting the process of voting in that county to see if you are on the voter registration list, were down county-wide. We worked with our advocates on the ground at Democracy North Carolina, the NAACP, and the Southern Coalition for Justice Center to seek relief to extend polling place hours county-wide. Although we did not get that immediate relief, there were at least, I believe, 6 to 8 precincts where those hours were extended, and that is very much the result of the work of election protection. Folks that were in Macon-Bibb certainly knew an interesting new challenge of, as you all were at the polls, people saying that that election protection was intimidating voters, and luckily we were able to work quickly because of the relationship with the sheriff in that county, and as well as the board of the chief elections officer to remedy that quickly. Macon-Bibb has been something that we have really been concentrating on with the NAACP there. Folks may have heard that earlier this year. A polling place in a precinct, a predominantly African-American precinct, had moved to the sheriff's office. And through the advocacy on the ground, we were able to move that polling location. And on election day, people were able to cast their ballots in an African American church. And those are just some. One other story that I think is particularly unique that I will share is also in Durham County. Because of the challenges with the e-poll books, it was what we had to do was basically they had to, instead of like rip things off and paste it, they actually had to cut scissors, use scissors to cut the registration list, and they were running out of scissors. So our volunteers on the ground actually went and bought more scissors so they could help the election officials there. It turns out they had to get them certified by the county themselves, but I think it just shows a very unique way where election protection really just tries to be very resourceful and think about different ways that, you know, it's just brass tacks of thinking of ways to help voters.
Chris, I'm gonna jump in just because we're starting to go way behind, and I'm so grateful to you for your partnership. I'm just going to move us along a little bit. Thank you to the Lawyers Committee. Rabbi Joel Mosbacher, if you could move the conversation, share with us some reflection, not only your experience, but also broaden the frame to the meaning of the election. Go ahead, Joel.
Thank you. Having marched in Georgia on America's journey for justice and having brought together with my congregation 10 people to do voter registration in High Point, North Carolina this summer, where we did so at a town fair in the shadow of an MRAP, a mine-resistant, armor-protected vehicle. The message to the adults and kids there at the town fair was that the folks of High Point are assumed to be dangerous, a scary experience indeed. I was privileged to be in Cincinnati, Ohio on Tuesday, working with election protection. The work felt deeply meaningful. I started the day at a polling place where everything was going smoothly, and having called into headquarters, they moved me to a different polling place where the demographics were probably close to 50-50 white folks and people of color. In that place, in the 7 hours that I was there, dozens of folks were required to vote provisionally. But we noticed a pattern in that voting, and that was that not every person of color was told to vote provisionally. But what was also stark, perhaps it was a coincidence, but I guess not, I would guess not, was that not a single white person was required to vote provisionally. And so stories we'd heard about voter suppression in our training suddenly became clear, and it was clear that there's so much work to do on racial justice, on the sacred right to vote. So much more is under threat. So for this moment, as I think of my colleagues whose work it is to bring healing and comfort and inspiration this Shabbat and the Shabbatot to come, I turn to our sacred teachings to attempt to bring us comfort and strength in this moment. So I would offer briefly 2 texts on fear and 2 texts on moving ahead. Firstly, a text on fear and worry and concern. There's a text that we know, a text written by Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav that we sing all the time. The text is Kol ha'olam kulo, the entire world is a narrow bridge. Va'ikar lo lefached klal, the main thing is not to be afraid. That's the text that was set to music, I believe in the 1970s. But Rabbi Nachman's text originally doesn't say Va'ikar lo lefached klal, the important thing is not to be afraid. Rabbi Nachman wrote Va'ikar lo lehitbached klal, the important thing, I would translate with respect to Rabbi Nachman, is the important thing is not to freak yourself out, not to scare yourself. So there certainly are things to worry about in the aftermath of this election. We shouldn't be naive or Pollyannish or blind. And Rabbi Nachman, I think, would say that freaking ourselves out, working ourselves up, won't move us ahead. So I submit that for consideration for all of us. A second text on getting beyond fear to action would be the words of Psalm 118, Min ha-meitzar, from out of the narrow places I called to you. The eternal is my side, I have no fear. What can a person do to me? So even though we can't go back and change the outcome of this election, we have to remember that we still have a choice about how to respond to this meitzar, to this narrow space as we go forward. And as we've heard from our speakers, some inspiring ways to think about moving forward. And so on moving ahead, we will need to get out of our cocoon to understand the complexity of this nation. And so as our Torah portion teaches us to lech lecha, to go from this place as Abraham did to a place you do not know, we will need to begin to get out of our comfort zone. We need to begin to think about how we will relate to the 24% of Americans who elected our new president, because after all, that is the number. It was actually 24% of people who voted for our new president. So the first question is, how will we lech lecha? How will we get to a place we don't know, and how do we understand the folks who voted for our new president? And also, how will we relate to the 50% of those who didn't vote at all? And that's work that we have to do, and that we have the opportunity to do, not just to stay with the people that we know, not just to stay with the understanding that we know, not just to stay with the same cable channel that we know, and the same newspaper that we know, and the same neighbors that we know. How can we relate to other Americans as well? And similarly, and lastly, so many of us, myself included, have sheltered ourselves in our truth and have come to assume that those who don't look like us or think like us are somehow less than human. How can they be the way they are? And so we're reminded of a teaching from our sacred tradition: in a place where there are no humans, we must strive to be human. And this can work in two ways. We'll need to remember our humanity if and when others forget their humanity in the months and years ahead. And lastly, we need to check our assumptions that folks who voted differently than us, that might think differently than us, are somehow less than human. We can treat them that way, but it won't further our larger goals. So I would submit to you a double meaning of the text: in a place where you think there are no humans, we have to strive to be human and recognize the holiness in all people, even as we face the challenges in front of us. There's so much work to do. My congregation and all of my colleagues and friends are honored to work with the partners on this call and so many others, and we will move ahead with strength and from our sacred tradition. It's now my privilege to turn it over to a bold and brave leader and teacher of mine, Jennifer Kaufman.
Thank you, Joel. So when people think of the RAC, they usually think of federal advocacy and the work we do in Washington. In my time as chair of the Commission of Social Action, time and again, I've been so proud of our reform movement as a voice for justice in a troubled world. We've been there with words and actions. But we've also learned over the years that while sometimes not much gets done in Congress and things can look bleak for our agenda, real solutions to real issues are possible at a state and local level. The RAC has been instrumental in making that happen, and I want to talk about just one example from this week to give you a much needed piece of good news. Reform California is a campaign of reform congregations in California joining to work with each other and with coalition partners across lines of difference on matters of social justice. In past years, we've engaged in successful legislative campaigns to protect undocumented residents, increase affordable housing, and end racial profiling. This year, instead of legislative advocacy, we decided to continue our work on racial justice through a different lens and focus on a statewide criminal justice initiative. Proposition 57, the Public Safety and Rehabilitation Act, was spearheaded by Governor Brown and had three basic components to it. It made nonviolent felons eligible for parole at an earlier date. It increased opportunities for prisoners to earn education and work credits while incarcerated. And maybe most importantly, it gave judges rather than prosecutors the authority to decide whether a minor should be tried as a juvenile or an adult. We developed the Tikkun Tikva campaign to restore hope, reform sentencing, and engage voters. So how did we start and what did we do? And I'm hoping that by giving you a brief overview, you get a little bit of a template for what can be done on a local level to make a difference. We had actually begun testing interest in working on a criminal justice measure when in April, Governor Brown asked to meet with a group of rabbis to garner support for Prop 57. By summer, we had more than 30 congregations across the state committed to participating in the campaign. Our leadership team, which is composed of fabulous RAC staff, clergy, and lay leaders, developed materials for congregational use that explained the politics of Prop 57 and the Jewish values underlying our support for the measure. We knew this initiative was going to have opposition from district attorneys and some law enforcement, but we also knew that it had bipartisan support. A lot of our congregants would support it for moral reasons, while others would support it for fiscal concerns. Incarceration, as you know, is very expensive, and California, unfortunately, like a lot of states, spends more money on prisons than on education. It was very important to give congregations the tools they needed to meet their members wherever they were. So we gave it to them, the nuts and bolts on the proposition and what it would do, its financial implications for the state, and importantly and uniquely, Jewish texts for discussion. We learned in previous campaigns that we needed both clergy and lay leaders involved. An engaged rabbi or cantor was essential to motivating a congregation to participate, and lay leadership was essential to channel that participation in a meaningful way. We asked each congregation to develop a Tikkun Tikva team composed of a clergy leader and 1 to 3 congregants, and we asked them to commit to involving their congregation in any or all of several facets of the campaign. Involvement took many different forms. Each congregation decided to do what was going to work best for them. So, for example, on Tisha B'Av, congregations in the Los Angeles area joined together, and congregations in the San Francisco Bay Area did the same to learn and study. We had a statewide webinar that featured one of the drafters of Prop 57, rabbis who explained why criminal justice reform was a Jewish issue, and a young man who very movingly talked about his own incarceration and what this initiative would mean to others. We held a summit in Sacramento with coalition partners, and congregants and clergy from across the state made the trek at their own expense. We had nearly 80 people from 19 congregations. Governor Brown addressed the group. Participants learned about Prop 57, the Jewish values involved in the campaign, and it gave them an opportunity to strategize about what this campaign might look like in their own congregation. Some rabbis talked about Proposition 57 in their High Holy Day sermons, linking concepts of teshuvah to this ballot measure. Other congregations discussed Prop 57 and general issues of criminal justice at Yom Kippur afternoon symposia. A number distributed pledge cards to increase awareness and engage congregants. And as it grew closer to election time, congregations had panels with speakers, often joining with other groups such as PICO affiliates, League of Women Voters, local federations, and the National Council of Jewish Women. We were able to capitalize on our interest on a very full California ballot. I think you may know we had 17 initiatives to vote on, and we were able to promote conversations about Prop 57. And perhaps even more importantly, we went beyond the walls of our synagogues. In addition to community learning gatherings, many congregations across the state worked with coalition partners in phone banking, registering voters, and helping with get out the vote efforts. These efforts paid off. 33 Reform congregations and thousands of individual Reform Jews participated in Tikkun Tikva, and on Tuesday, Prop 57 passed with 64% of the vote, and the lives of thousands of people will change for the better. We're not going to sit back and savor this win for long, particularly after the results on a national level. We're already beginning to think about what our next campaign might be. Maybe we'll focus on criminal justice reform and racial justice. Perhaps we'll do something different. Whatever the issue, our focus is going to remain the same. Nitzavim. We will stand up. We will continue to work together across lines of difference to make a more just and compassionate California. And I can't think of a better commitment following this week's election. So while that's one story with a happy ending, I know how concerned we all are with the future. What's our country going to look like in coming months? I can't think of a time when the reform movement's commitment to social justice and its actions, walking the walk, have been needed more on a federal and state level. And as someone reminded us yesterday, we will never stop believing that fighting for what's right is worth it. But our ability to continue and expand our work depends on each of you. We need your involvement on every possible level, and we need your financial support. It's that support that makes our national and state work possible. This is the time of year when many of us make our year-end contributions. So I'm going to take just a second to say, please, please make a gift to the RAC. Increase what you were planning to give, or do what I'm going to do, increase what you already gave. Your gift could not come at a more important time. And Jonah, let me turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you for your time, your energy, your talent, and of course, your investment in the RAC. We appreciate it. I think it's important that we celebrate the victory in California, and it's an inspiration that even when things are not moving on a federal level, we can move things on a state and local level, and we will double down on our commitment to the work we're doing in Ohio, in California, in New York, and across these United States. I'm going to now, though, turn it over to Barb, because obviously the consequence of this election are enormous and even much broader than voting access, racial justice, and criminal justice reform. So she's going to take a couple minutes and really walk us through the broader agenda and what we're up against. Barb?
Thanks, Jonah. Well, we've heard a little bit already on this call, actually quite a bit already on this call, reflecting what a powerful community we are. And we provide each other with strength and with sustenance in every season. And our mission remains what it has always been. We are committed to the work of Tikkun Olam. We're engaging our congregations, our congregants, our clergy, all of you in the work of social justice. And that is as true today as it was last week, last year, and throughout our history. And really, throughout the nearly 60 years that the RAC has been in existence, we've worked meaningfully and successfully with members of Congress and administrations from both parties. And we really take pride in that bipartisan history, those relationships, and we always will. You know, we speak often, especially in the context of Nitzavim, that the last time the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized, it was signed into law by President George W. Bush. There have been thousands of lives, really countless lives, that have been transformed and saved by the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief, a landmark AIDS initiative that President Bush created and championed. Comprehensive immigration reform, not too long ago, was a bipartisan effort. And we're going to continue to seek out those opportunities as we champion the issues that are central to our work. Achieving racial justice, halting the threat of climate change, reforming our broken immigration system, even as we respond to the world's worst refugee crisis in history. LGBT equality, protecting women's rights, continuing the United States' leading role as Israel's ally, and of course, providing health care for all, and on and on. And we know that these things are at stake and in jeopardy. We know that. And throughout the campaign, President-elect Trump made statements that put us on notice that we are going to have to come together as Reform Jews with our allies, like those on this call, and protect what we've achieved in each of these areas and others. And it is definitely not going to be easy. But we remember as well that the president cannot act alone in so many circumstances. The president needs to act with Congress, and the relationships that we have as a movement, that each person on this call has with their local officials, with their members of Congress, are going to be more essential than ever to our work that we do together as a movement. And we see already that the changing face of Congress is going to have an impact. In the midst of all the focus on the presidential results, it's really important to remember that Congress is starting to look a little bit more like America looks. We have the first Latina senator who was elected from Nevada. Kamala Harris, the new senator from California who's taking Senator Barbara Boxer's seat, is African American, will be the only current Black female in the Senate. And in the House, there's going to be the first Somali American Muslim member of Congress, the first Indian American to hold a seat as well. And so all of these relationships, building our connections with these individuals and all the members of the 115th Congress, are going to be essential to making sure that whenever the issues that we care about are at stake, from initiatives coming out of the White House, we're going to have those relationships to work with in Congress as well. And so I hope, especially this year, you will be able to join us for the consultation on conscience in Washington from April 30th to May 2nd. It is going to be an opportunity to get to know some of these new members of Congress, and especially to be with other congregational leaders like yourself who are committed to speaking truth to power, to doing the work of Tikkun Olam. And I hope as well that you'll come as a delegation to strengthen your ability to do this work with others in your congregation. Just 3 people coming together not only multiplies the power of the consultation experience, but it gets you a nice discount on registration. And we've got our special discounted rate that is on right now through November 22nd. So I hope that we will see you there. And as always, that we're going to continue to do this vital justice work together as we have for so long. Jonah?
Thanks, Barb. We're just within the last couple of minutes of the call. I want to summarize very briefly and do a little bit of a call to action. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our staff, Joy and Barb, and of course, Kara and Graham and everybody who put this together, and Sophie. Thank you to Cornell Brooks and Chris Melody Fields for your partnership. Thank you, Rabbi Joel Mosbacher and Jennifer Kaufman, for your leadership. Thank you to the hundreds of you, not only who called in today, but who engage in this work. Many of you are our funders, and many of you are our activists who on a state and local level and here in Washington live our values. And so I want to summarize 3 key points. Number 1, we focused on voting rights for a reason. Now more than ever, given how close this election was, given the popular vote, given the importance of state legislators, given the importance of local work, we must make sure that every vote counts. We got to double down on our efforts to register voters, to turn out voters, and protect the vote. We will continue over the next 2 and 4 years to prioritize election protection and voting access, and we will fight for and win the Voting Rights Act. Number 2, state and local work. We should not be discouraged. Kol ha'olam kulo, yes, the whole world is a gesher tzar me'od, a very narrow bridge. It's so narrow that it becomes local. So Rabbi Mosbacher, you are right. We should not freak out. We should get local and we should organize. County by county, city by city, state by state. We need to make wins for social justice, even as we are in a broader national landscape that is very challenging. And so third and finally, let's talk about that broader national landscape. In many ways, this election was an earthquake. That's how it's been described. And in many ways, we saw the issue agenda that we had for this next period of time come under siege because of the transition. We will not step back at all from that agenda. The issues that Barb lifted up are core values and core issues to the Reformed Jewish movement, and we will continue to reach across lines of race, class, and faith into coalitions and fight for the things we care most deeply about. And we can't do it without all of your help on a state and local level to engage with us and to organize. Just this morning, I was at a coalition press conference with Cornell Brooks, with the folks from the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights. The Lawyers Committee was there, and an array of civil rights organizations. Together, we stood firm in our resolve. This is a challenge that will be overcome. We will defend civil rights and social justice in America by standing strong together in the coalition of the willing. We were inspired by Cornell William Brooks' reference to Esther, who teaches us that it is just at a time like this that we hear God's voice, saying now more than ever, as God spoke to us through Goodman and Cheney and Schwerner 50 years ago, as we understood our role in the civil rights movement then and stood up and took risk, now we are hearing that challenge again. It was for such a time as this moment, that we are called to act, to organize, to mobilize, and to lead. And so I want to end with words of prayer. Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu ve'imotenu, God of our mothers and God of our fathers. And more important on this day, at this moment, God of our daughters and God of our sons. Speak to us as you spoke to Shiphrah and to Puah, the Hebrew midwives who resisted Pharaoh's decree. God who spoke through Miriam and Yocheved, women who saved lives. God who spoke to the daughter of Pharaoh in the conspiracy of resistance among Shiphrah and Puah and Miriam and Yocheved and the daughter of Pharaoh. God who brought Miriam into the conspiracy of resistance along with Esther, who joined in the resistance of a politics of division and bigotry and hate. We will hear your charge. We will come together, building bridges, creating relationships, and hearing your voice in the joint work that we will do with our partners as we bring about your vision for a world of wholeness and justice and peace, living the words of the prophets. What is our job? To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for leading with us. And may God bless all of you, and may God bless America and all people everywhere. Amen.